I never imagined my life would veer off course on a cold autumn morning in Charleston, South Carolina, standing in a bridal suite that wasn't mine, staring at a wedding dress that wasn't meant for me. My name is Cassidy Harris, 27, a small-town graphic designer who never liked drama until my mother made sure I became the center of it. The dress hanging before me was meant for my older sister Vanessa, glamorous, confident, and forever our family's shining star. But Vanessa was gone. 3 days before the wedding, she disappeared. No note, no calls. Just a single text to my mother, "I can't go through with this. You figure it out." And figure it out, Mom did. "You're taking her place, Cassidy?" She hissed that morning, her nails digging into my wrist as she zipped me into silk that smelled like another woman's perfume. If this wedding doesn't happen, everything falls apart. Everything. That meant Dad's ailing construction business, the mortgage payments, the car lease. Vanessa had been engaged to Ethan Caldwell, a wealthy entrepreneur from Atlanta who lost his sight 2 years ago in a boating accident, but retained his legendary charm and fortune. I had spoken with Ethan for 6 months already. See, Vanessa hated phone calls, especially with a man she barely cared for and who couldn't see her worth, as she put it. "You sound just like me," she insisted. "Just talk to him. Pretend. It's temporary." Temporary turned into daily chats. Then inside jokes. Then an almost terrifying familiarity I knew when Ethan was smiling, even through silence, could hear in his pauses the subtle weariness of a man living in darkness. But we never met. And today here I was buttoning myself into the role of his bride. When I stepped out of the bridal suite, the mansion's great hall looked surreal, white roses, crystal chandeliers, polished marble, all blinding in their perfection. Guests filled every row, whispering behind fans and clinking glasses. My mother stood at the far end, her face tight with determination. "This is your duty now," she mouthed silently. And there he was, Ethan Caldwell, 34, standing tall at the altar, dressed immaculately in a dark blue suit. His eyes gently closed, but his posture strikingly aware. His seeing-eye dog Harper sat obediently by his side. I inhaled deeply. Each step toward him felt like walking a tightrope strung between my conscience and my family's expectations. When we reached the vows, my voice trembled but stayed steady. "I do," I whispered. The applause felt like a hollow drumbeat in my chest. The crowd erupted. Champagne flowed. To them, it was a perfect union. But only I knew that the woman Ethan was marrying wasn't who he thought. At the reception, I sat beside him, nervous laughter filling the air around us. I could feel his attention on me, attuned to the slightest hesitation in my voice, the uneven pace of my breathing. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan said softly, his head tilted as though listening beyond sound itself. "Just overwhelmed," I replied, forcing a smile. "You're different," he murmured. I froze. "Different," I echoed, feigning surprise. "The way you speak. The way your hand trembled when we said our vows," he explained gently, his fingers grazing the edge of my wrist. I laughed it off, brushing a lock of hair behind my ear. Cold feet, I guess. But inside my stomach twisted. Was I fooling him, or had he already begun to suspect? That evening, as the limousine pulled away from the estate and carried us toward his secluded lake house in Georgia, I stole glances at him. He kept his hands folded in his lap, calm, composed. "You place your perfume differently today," he said, suddenly startling me. My heart hammered in my chest. I had used Vanessa's perfume for every video call before Floral Sharp. But today, I'd forgotten. The subtle scent of lavender that clung to me was my own. "It's a new bottle," I said too quickly. He nodded but didn't press further. His fingers tapped softly against the leather seat as though searching for a rhythm only he could hear. By the time we arrived, the lake house seemed colder than I imagined. Dark, modern, all stone and steel. Inside, the staff moved like shadows, greeting us politely, discreetly vanishing. Dinner was served in a small dining room where a single candle flickered between us. "Do you remember what you said on our first phone call?" Ethan asked after a few minutes of silence, and I panicked. How could I? I had only stepped into the conversation, halfway through Vanessa's engagement, inheriting an act that began before I even knew the man. "You said you'd always dreamed of visiting Tuscany?" He continued, smiling faintly. "Oh, yes," I mumbled. "Tuscany," he repeated almost wistfully. "Vanessa never cared for travel, you know." I felt my breath catch. He was testing me. Later that night, alone in the guest room prepared for me, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring on my finger. My mother's words still echoed in my mind. "Just a few months, Cassidy. After that, disappear if you want. You'll have saved the family." Saved the family or sold myself? When Ethan knocked lightly on the door and asked if I wanted tea, I hesitated, then followed him to the kitchen. He moved confidently, memorizing every corner with his hands. "You placed the sugar bowl to the left today," he commented as I set the tray. I smiled awkwardly. "Is that unusual?" "You always placed it to the right during our dinners on the calls," he said calmly. There it was again, his uncanny ability to sense tiny changes. "People change habits," I whispered. "Do they?" he asked quietly. That night, I lay awake listening to the soft lap of water against the dock just outside our window. The moonlight pooled on the hardwood floors like an invitation to confess or to continue the charade. and I felt torn. In just a few short hours, Ethan had shown a depth I hadn't expected. Not simply observant, but emotionally present, attuned to every ripple in a person's behavior. I thought I could play this role. I thought I could vanish afterward. But something about the way he spoke, the way he listened, not with his ears but with his entire being, made me wonder if he had seen through me from the very beginning. I woke the next morning before sunrise, wrapped in silence so thick I could almost taste it. The lake was still. The air inside Ethan's lake house smelled of cedar and the faintest trace of his cologne, a scent that somehow managed to make me feel comforted and exposed at the same time. I padded barefoot into the kitchen, more out of instinct than duty, determined to at least prepare coffee the way he liked it. Dark roast black, precisely 195 degrees. No sugar, no distractions. But even as I moved, I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that Ethan knew exactly who I wasn't. He hadn't confronted me directly, but his pointed comments about details, the perfume, the placement of the sugar bowl had been more than casual remarks. They were probes, soft, surgical. A man who couldn't see but seemed to watch me more closely than anyone ever had. As the coffee brewed, I caught my reflection in the glass door of the microwave. I hardly recognized the woman staring back. My face still carried the innocent features that let my mother manipulate me so easily, soft mouth, wide eyes, an expression that always looked a little too eager to please. But underneath that, something darker had begun to grow, a kind of hardened resolve that I couldn't quite name. And that terrified me more than the lie itself. I carried the coffee into the sunroom where Ethan was already sitting. He wore a simple navy sweater and jeans, his posture relaxed but his head tilted slightly as though he'd heard me long before I entered. Harper, his golden retriever, lay curled at his feet, rising slightly when I set the coffee cup gently on the table beside him. "You're an early riser today," he said, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I nodded before remembering he couldn't see it, couldn't sleep. Neither could I. His tone held something beneath it, a weight that felt almost like curiosity but with a sharper edge. He gestured to the chair opposite him, and I sat folding my hands carefully in my lap as though that would steady me. He reached for the coffee without hesitation and took a slow sip, then set it down deliberately. His fingers traced the rim of the cup, once a gesture that felt almost symbolic, like he was mapping out the contours of something unseen, perhaps even the distance between the truth and the lie sitting right across from him. "You know," he said, suddenly breaking the quiet, "my mother always said that people reveal themselves in the smallest rituals. The way they butter toast, the way they pour tea, the way they leave their shoes by the door." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He turned slightly, his unseeing gaze directed almost exactly at me. "I just wonder what your habits will tell me about you, now that you're really here." His words felt like an invitation and a challenge at the same time, but I couldn't answer. Not without tearing open the fragile script I had been trying so desperately to memorize. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning at the edge of my thoughts since last night. "Did Vanessa? Did she ever tell you why she agreed to this marriage?" There was a long pause, the kind that made every second feel heavier than the last. "No," he said finally, "but I always suspected it wasn't about me." That answer, quiet as it was, felt like an arrow straight through my chest. I'd been living under the assumption that I was deceiving him, but maybe he had always known there was a deception at work. Maybe he had simply chosen to ignore it to play along. But why? The question lingered unanswered as the day stretched on. We fell into an odd rhythm over the next several days. Breakfasts eaten together in polite conversation, afternoons spent walking around the lake with Harper, evenings filled with quiet dinners where the silence between us felt less like comfort and more like a battlefield. And every moment I could feel Ethan watching me, not with his eyes, but with every other sense available to him. The emotional weight was unbearable. On the third night, I finally cracked. It happened in the library, a dark-paneled room that smelled of old books and leather. I had retreated there after dinner, desperate for a moment alone, running my fingers along the spines of novels I'd never read and probably never would. But then I heard the soft pad of Harper's paws and the unmistakable sound of Ethan's cane tapping gently against the floor. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice impossibly calm. I turned quickly, startled. "I didn't think you'd come in." "Vanessa never did," he replied, lowering himself carefully into a worn leather armchair near the window. "She told me she didn't like old books, too dusty." His smile was faint, almost nostalgic, but underneath it I could sense the calculation. He was telling me in his own subtle way that he knew exactly what he was doing by being here. I sat across from him, gripping the armrest tightly to keep from trembling. He tilted his head. "You've been quiet, Cassidy." The use of my real name sent a shockwave through me like... I started to speak but stopped immediately. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you really think I didn't know? From the first time you answered her phone for her? The tone of your voice was different. The way you laughed, it wasn't forced like hers, it was real." My heart thundered in my chest. "Why didn't you say anything?" I whispered. He sat back, his expression unreadable. "Because I was waiting to see how long you'd keep pretending." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from guilt exactly, but from the sheer relief of being seen. Truly seen for the first time in months, maybe years. "You were supposed to marry Vanessa," I said softly, "not me." He smiled, but it wasn't bitter or cruel. It was gentle, almost sad. "Maybe that was the plan," he admitted. "But plans change. People change." Then he said something that turned my entire world upside down. "I knew the day she left." I froze. "What do you mean?" He exhaled slowly as though preparing himself for something difficult. "The day she disappeared, she called me. She told me she couldn't go through with it, that she didn't love me, that she never did. And then she said something else, something that stuck with me." His hands tightened around the arms of the chair. She said, "Cassidy will make a better wife than I ever could. She's better at pretending to care." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Vanessa had planned this. She hadn't just abandoned Ethan, she had orchestrated my entrapment, convinced our mother, manipulated everyone into believing this was my duty. She said that I asked my voice hollow. He nodded. "And I believed her. I believed you'd be better at pretending. But then, you started leaving your shoes by the door differently. You changed the sugar bowl, you stopped wearing her perfume." Little things, small rebellions, I noticed. He leaned forward again, his unseeing eyes locked on me with terrifying precision. "So, Cassidy, are you still pretending?" The question hung between us like a blade. I wanted to answer. I wanted to confess everything, to tell him about my mother's threats, about the debts, about the way Vanessa had used me like a pawn in a game I hadn't even realized I was playing. But before I could speak, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Harper immediately rose to her feet, ears alert. Ethan stayed perfectly still, listening. And then, almost as if scripted, my mother's voice drifted through the door. "Cassidy, darling, we need to talk." I stood frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place. Ethan reached for his cane, rising slowly. "Looks like our quiet little arrangement just got complicated," he murmured. His words were calm, but his grip on the cane was tight, his knuckles pale. "Are you going to open it?" he asked, turning his head slightly toward me. And just like that, the moment of truth arrived. For the first time since this charade began, I realized the choice was entirely mine. I could keep pretending, or I could finally step into the light. But as I approached the door, my heart pounding, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a wedding or a lie or even a betrayal. This was about freedom. And for the first time, I wasn't sure which side of that door it waited on. The knock at the front door echoed again, sharp and deliberate. Harper whined softly at Ethan's feet, but stayed perfectly still. For a heartbeat, no one moved, the whole house holding its breath with me. My mother's voice followed, cool and commanding, as always, cutting through the air like a blade. "Cassidy, open this door. Now." I closed my eyes. For years, that voice dictated every step I took, every choice I made. Her voice was my compass and my chain. But standing here in this cold, modern house beside a man who knew my lie and hadn't turned me away, something shifted. I felt that old automatic instinct to obey crack just slightly. And through that crack slipped a question I'd never dared ask. What if I didn't open that door? Ethan, calm as ever, lowered himself into the chair nearest the entrance. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "I'm not stopping you, but I'm not rushing to welcome them either." His faith startled me. Even after everything, he was still handing me power when all I'd done was deceive him. I hesitated, fingertips brushing the doorknob, pulse racing. The oak door between us wasn't just a door, it was a wall built from years of obedience, guilt, and debt. I felt my fingers curl around the handle, felt the familiar reflex to just let her in to avoid the storm she would surely bring. But then I dropped my hand, stepped back, and whispered, "No." Outside, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, muffled but unmistakable. Her next words were harsher. "Cassidy, don't test me. You know why we're here." I didn't respond. Ethan said nothing either, but when I turned toward him, I saw a faint smile play at the corners of his mouth, a smile not of amusement, but of quiet recognition. He knew this was a test. It was the first real decision I'd made since stepping into this charade. I walked slowly back to the kitchen, my legs shaky, but my steps firm. Ethan followed without a word, Harper padding quietly beside him. By the time we sat down at the kitchen island, I could hear my mother's footsteps retreating, her heels clicking sharply on the stone pathway. She would be back, that much I knew, but for now I'd bought myself time. Ethan reached for his coffee mug, fingertips brushing the rim thoughtfully. "You didn't open it," he said softly. I nodded, no. His next words came so quietly that I almost missed them. Good. The simple weight of that approval settled over me like a blanket, not smothering, not controlling, just acknowledgement. I hadn't realized how starved I was for that. But peace didn't last long. Later that evening, after we shared a simple dinner in relative quiet, a courier arrived, slipping an envelope under the door and leaving without ringing the bell. I recognized the stationery instantly. My mother's handwriting, sharp, perfect cursive. It wasn't just a letter, it was a summons. I opened it slowly, dreading every word before I even read them. Cassidy, it began by now. You understand that this arrangement is not yours to alter. You agreed to marry Ethan for the good of this family, and that commitment extends beyond ceremony. Tomorrow morning, we will return. Do not humiliate yourself or us any further. No apology, no warmth, just control wrapped in expensive paper. It was signed in full Caroline Harris. She never signed her name like that unless she was making a point. I crumpled the letter instinctively, but Ethan reached out his hand, hovering just above mine. May I read it? I hesitated, then smoothed the paper out again and placed it in his hands. His fingers traced each line, slow and deliberate. I realized then that he wasn't reading. He was feeling the indentations of her pen, literally tracing her aggression letter by letter. After a long silence, he folded the letter neatly and set it aside. You're free here, he said simply. The words sounded too good to be true. But am I really? I asked quietly. The question wasn't rhetorical, and he knew it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. That's for you to decide. But I won't chain you to this house or this lie. That clarity cut through the fog of obligation I'd been drowning in for months. If he wasn't holding me captive, then I was the one keeping myself trapped. That realization felt as terrifying as it was liberating. I barely slept that night. I kept pacing the bedroom, running every scenario through my head. What if I walked away? What if I stayed? What would freedom even look like now? Could I really go back to the life I had before, a life lived half in shadow, half in apology? Somewhere around 3 a.m., staring out at the glassy surface of the lake, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living between doors half open, half closed. I would choose, and not just react. The next morning, I woke early, dressed deliberately in my own clothes for the first time in days. Not the tailored silk my mother insisted was proper for Ethan's wife, but a simple sweater and jeans that smelled faintly of lavender detergent and home. My hair pulled back loosely, no makeup, no mask. I found Ethan already seated in the sunroom, listening to the breeze ripple through the tall grass beyond the glass walls. Without ceremony, I sat across from him and spoke my truth for the first time since this began. Vanessa planned this, I said quietly. She told my mother that I'd take her place. She walked away from this marriage because she never cared about you or anyone but herself. He didn't react immediately, just listened. I lied to you, I continued. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't think I had a choice. His head tilted slightly, Harper resting her chin on his foot. And now, he asked? I swallowed hard. Now I choose to stop lying. That was when I took off the wedding ring. I placed it on the table between us, a symbol of the entire charade, and pushed it gently toward him. I won't pretend anymore, I said simply. Whatever happens, it will happen honestly. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing the cool gold band. But he didn't pick it up. Instead, he left it there as though it belonged to neither of us anymore. Then he smiled, small, quiet. Good, he whispered. Just then the phone rang. The landline, not my cell, not his phone. I rose to answer it automatically, but something about Ethan's expression stopped me. He turned his head slightly, listening intently. I know that ringtone, he said. What is it, I asked. It's the private line, only one person uses it. A pause. My attorney. A chill slid down my spine. When I answered, the voice on the other end was crisp and professional. Mr. Caldwell, this is Daniel Stokes. I hope I'm not interrupting. I just wanted to confirm that you authorized the transfer of 35% of Caldwell Technologies to Caroline Harris this afternoon. I froze, blood draining from my face. What? I handed the receiver to Ethan with trembling fingers, my breath caught in my throat. He listened carefully, saying very little, but his grip on the handset tightened perceptibly. When he hung up, he sat very still for a long moment. Then he turned to me and asked the question that changed everything. Did you know? My heart shattered. I had no idea what my mother had done behind my back, but somehow she had convinced the board, or the legal team, that Ethan had agreed to transfer a third of his company to her. In exchange for what? Me. Suddenly, it all made sense. The rushed wedding. Her insistence that I play the part perfectly. This wasn't just about saving our family's debts. It was about ownership, power, control. I had been a pawn all along, but not just in a family drama, in a corporate scheme. I sank into the chair opposite Ethan, tears burning behind my eyes. No, I whispered. I didn't know. But even as I said it, I realized something else. It didn't matter whether I knew or not. To Ethan, the betrayal was real. He leaned back slowly, the serenity in his posture now completely gone. Then we have a bigger problem than pretending to be married, he said finally. And as those words hung in the air between us, I knew the next chapter of this story would demand something I wasn't sure I had yet. Courage not just to confess, but to fight. For him. For myself. For the truth. The silence after Ethan's words felt heavier than any accusation. I sat across from him, stunned, as he traced his fingertips over the edge of the abandoned wedding ring still resting on the table between us. His face remained unreadable calm on the surface, but I could feel the tension humming underneath. He wasn't asking if I had signed papers or handled contracts. He was asking whether I had known from the beginning that this entire marriage had been engineered not as a desperate act to save my family, but as a corporate transaction. My mother's version of a hostile takeover with me as the bait. I didn't know I repeated my voice hollow but honest. "Ethan, I swear to you I didn't." For the first time since the wedding, he didn't smile faintly in that calm, almost reassuring way that had unnerved me. He simply nodded once, slow and deliberate. But there was something cold in the gesture, a distance creeping in. Then he stood reaching for his cane with steady precision and said quietly, "We'll need to fix this, Cassidy. You're not the one I'm angry with. But they underestimated me, and that's something your mother will soon regret." His words were sharp, but not cruel. He wasn't lashing out, he was calculating. I could feel it, a man used to control, reasserting himself quietly, efficiently. He tapped his way toward his study, a dark paneled room I hadn't yet entered since arriving at the lake house. I followed, hesitant at first, but determined. I couldn't just sit at that kitchen table and wait for this storm to pass over me, not anymore. When I stepped into the study, I was surprised by its warmth. The walls were lined with books, their spines worn and familiar, not untouched like those in the library downstairs. The desk was cluttered, but in an orderly way, covered with small objects, braille notepads, pens, a magnifying glass still sitting beside a folded leather case, as if Ethan refused to let his blindness erase who he had been before the accident. The room felt lived in, real. It was the first time in days I realized I was seeing something authentic in this house, and that meant something. Ethan picked up his phone, dialing smoothly without hesitation. His attorney answered immediately, and I listened as Ethan's voice, soft but steely, cut through every polite preamble. "Daniel, I need to review every document my office has received from the Harris family in the last 3 months. All contracts, all proposed shares, everything. And Daniel, do not contact them until I say so." I watched Yed as he ended the call, placed the phone precisely back on its cradle, and then turned toward me, though his gaze landed somewhere just to the right of my shoulder. "Tell me everything," he said simply. "Start from the beginning. When did your mother first ask you to take Vanessa's place?" So I did. I sat across from him and poured out the entire story, not just the lies about the phone calls or the rushed wedding, but everything. The debts, the family business failing. My mother's whispered assurances that I would save us all if I just stepped into Vanessa's shoes. The guilt that had followed me my entire life for being second best, the one who was supposed to fix everything without asking for anything. He sat quietly, never interrupting, only nodding occasionally. When I described how my mother had convinced me it was temporary, that I could disappear after a few months, his expression didn't change, but I could sense the anger simmering beneath his stillness. "You know," he said quietly when I finished. "The irony is that I always suspected Vanessa was using me. I just never expected that her family would think they could outmaneuver me too." He turned his head slightly, a faint smile ghosting his lips for the first time since the phone call. "I don't hold grudges lightly, Cassidy. But when I do, I see them through." His words sent a chill down my spine, not because I feared him, but because I knew that he meant every word. This was no longer about whether I could continue pretending to be Vanessa's substitute. It was about whether I would help him take back control or whether I would let my mother's plan continue unchecked. And for the first time since I'd walked down that aisle, I felt the stirrings of something entirely new. Not guilt, not shame, but resolve. My mother had used me my entire life. My sister had abandoned me to clean up her mess. And now they had dragged me into a plot that threatened Ethan's company, his legacy, his independence. Enough. I met Ethan's gaze even though he couldn't see me. "What do you need me to do?" That question felt dangerous even as I asked it, but also necessary. He smiled again, this time wider, though still faint. "You'll accompany me to Atlanta tomorrow," he said. "We're going to meet with my board. I want them to see us together." I swallowed hard. "Together." He nodded. "You may have been coerced into this marriage, but that doesn't mean we can't use it to our advantage. They need to believe we're aligned, even if we're not." His honesty stunned me. He wasn't asking me to play the doting wife. He was asking me to stand beside him as an ally, not an actress. I didn't know whether I was ready for that, but what choice did I have? That night, as I packed a small overnight bag for the trip, I kept thinking about the symbolism of what we were about to do. For so long, my life had revolved around appearances, pretending to be Vanessa, pretending to agree, pretending to belong. But tomorrow we would walk into that boardroom together, not as a couple, not as a lie, but as two people who had both been manipulated and were now ready to push back. I wasn't sure whether Ethan trusted me yet, but I realized that I trusted him. Not as a husband, not even as a friend, but as a man who had lived with blindness and learned to see through everything that really mattered. The next morning, the drive to Atlanta felt surreal. Ethan sat beside me in the backseat of the car, Harper resting quietly at his feet. He didn't speak much, but his calm was reassuring. When we pulled up to the glass and steel headquarters of Caldwell Technologies, I felt an immediate rush of nerves, but I suppressed it. There was no room for hesitation today. We walked in together side by side. The receptionist looked up immediately, her expression flickering from polite welcome to surprise, as she recognized me not as Vanessa, but as the woman who had replaced her. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said, recovering quickly. Ethan nodded. "Good morning, Jennifer. This is Cassidy Harris, my wife." His deliberate choice to use my name, not Vanessa's, made my stomach twist. It wasn't just a reveal, it was a statement. And everyone in that lobby heard it. Upstairs in the sleek, glass-walled boardroom, the directors were already assembled. Most were older men in expensive suits, their postures rigid, their smiles carefully polite but cold. At the head of the table sat Daniel Stokes, Ethan's attorney, who looked visibly relieved when we entered. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, standing, "we've compiled the documents as requested." Ethan nodded. "Good, let's get started." For the next hour, I sat beside him in silence as Daniel laid out every agreement, every proposed transfer, every signature. My mother's fingerprints were everywhere. She hadn't just manipulated me, she had manipulated his entire corporate structure using my presence as Vanessa to smooth the way for her power grab. And it almost worked. Until Ethan noticed how I placed the sugar bowl on the wrong side. That tiny act of rebellion was what saved him. And me. Finally, when the last document had been laid out, Ethan spoke not to Daniel, but to the entire board. "Gentlemen," he began, "you may have noticed that my wife is not Vanessa Harris." A murmur rippled through the room. "She's Cassidy," he continued. "And while she may have been sent here to deceive me, she's told me the truth. A truth that implicates the Harris family in an attempt to gain control of this company." His voice was quiet but devastatingly clear. Then he turned his head toward me. "Cassidy, would you care to explain how this began?" The entire room turned to me. My mouth went dry, but I nodded and spoke. For the first time in my life, I told my own story without fear of consequence, without apology, without permission. And when I finished, the boardroom fell into stunned silence. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, what do you propose we do?" Ethan smiled faintly, tilting his head toward me. "We sever all ties with the Harris family," he said simply, "and we start over." As we left the boardroom walking out into the bright Atlanta afternoon, Ethan slipped his arm lightly through mine. Not possessively, not as a show for the staff watching, but as an offer. An offer of solidarity, of mutual respect, of freedom. And I accepted it. But as we reached the car, my phone buzzed with a new message from my mother. "Cassidy, you're making a mistake. You think you're free, but you have no idea what we've set in motion." I stared at the screen, heart pounding, and I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. We rolled into the driveway of the lake house late that evening. The driveway's reflection of old pines in the still water looked like a cracked mirror. I stepped out of the car with Ethan and Harper, the breeze smelling of damp wood and distant storms. My phone buzzed again, another message from Mom. "Think carefully. You've been used before, a threat hidden in softness." I locked it silent. I didn't deserve to be used. After all I'd risked today, I wouldn't rewind. Inside, Ethan settled at his desk, sifting through printed resumes of document amendments he'd received from Daniel. The ring was still on the table between us, but this time it felt less like a shackle and more like debris from a collision. I poured myself a glass of water, the ice clinking. It was the simplest ritual I could manage in the chaos. I leaned back, studying the glass in my hand. Symbolic, I realized, clear but full of fractures when disturbed. That was me, translucent now, but still capable of breaking. Ethan looked up suddenly. "Your eyes are red," he said. "No accusation, just noticing, honest." I swallowed. "Your mother's messages," I admitted. "She's not giving up." He nodded slowly. "They won't, but neither will we." He pushed the ring across the desk toward me. "Keep it for now," he said. "It might come in useful." I stared at it. We both knew what he meant. Appearances would matter until the story changed. I slid the ring into my pocket. We both sat in silence for a moment. The house creaked around us, alive like a living thing. I wasn't ready to retreat. "What's next?" I asked, voice steady. Ethan reached out and grasped my hand. "We need a plan," he said. "A stopgap until we're ready to confront them openly." I felt a flicker of fear. Risk was my shadow these days, but when I looked at his expression in the dim light, I realized something. Actions aren't always safe, but they're necessary. "Tell me," I said. Morning came with a thunderstorm that rattled the windows. After years of always being the damsel in someone else's tempest, I woke ready to build my own arc. I joined Ethan in the study where printouts and spreadsheets adorned the desk like battle maps. His assistant, Daniel Stokes, sat nearby, a pen in hand. All faces were calm, but the tension was electric. Ethan began. "We're going public in 2 weeks. The media release will expose the attempted forced transfer. We'll frame it not as a betrayal, but as the turning point that redefines Caldwell Technologies' ethics." He paused. "Cassidy, When I drafted the release, I pictured you. I shivered. My life, my identity was front and center. You'll need to give the presentation. Honestly, my lungs tightened. Public speaking had never been my strength. But I swallowed the panic, not because I could fake courage, but because I would. I nodded slowly. Okay, Daniel looked at me directly. It's bold. But done well, it'll show that you're not a victim. You're a leader. I felt that internal shift again from pawn to participant to pathfinder. I couldn't hide behind Ethan anymore. I had to stand beside him fully. But just as we dove into planning slide decks and Q&A rehearsals, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Mom, this one attached to a video file. I let it play. It was a montage of moments, family celebrations, my graduation, Vanessa smiling while hugging me. Then at the end, my mother speaking directly into the camera, her voice cold, triumphant. If you go public, sweetheart, you'll be ruining more than just me. The screen went black, but her words didn't fade. Ethan saw it before I could close the phone. His face turned pale. What did she mean by that? I closed my eyes. They're not just after control of the company, I said. They're after something else. He reached for my hand, fingers brushing mine, solid. He didn't press me, but I could feel his mind racing. They were going deeper than shares. Something in that video threatened more than corporate reputation. We were back at a crossroads. That afternoon, Ethan invited me to join a virtual meeting with his public relations head, a woman named Grace. I sat in front of the laptop notes in front of me, hurricane of self-doubt swirling under skin. Grace's warm but confident tone guided me through expected questions from reporters. Why didn't you stand up earlier? How does this change your life? What will Caldwell Technologies do differently? She walked me through answers, honest, direct, focused on shared accountability. She emphasized one line that resonated like a heartbeat. Trust grows in cracks where the truth is finally told. I repeated it to myself until I believed it. Because I did believe it. Then I shared something new. We're not just addressing a forced transaction. We've been threatened personally. If we proceed, we risk more than public scrutiny. There was a pause on her end. Then Grace's voice steady. We can handle that. We'll build a narrative. The company stands with its people, with values. No threats scare us into silence. Hearing her say that gave me a strange comfort. It meant this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was becoming our fight. But underneath it, I could feel the tension rising. My mother had something in reserve, something big. And going public meant tipping our hand. When the meeting ended, Ethan and I stayed in front of the screen for a long while. He reached for my hand again. We'll face whatever comes, he said. I looked into those blind eyes, feeling them on me, not with pity, but with fierce commitment. Together, we would stand in that light, even if my mother pushed harder from behind the blinds. Late that evening, thunder boomed again. I found myself wandering down to the dock, shoes off toes, digging into damp boards. The lake churned under the storm. Usually I would have been afraid of water at night, but tonight I felt its pulse echo my own. Ethan joined me silent. Harper stayed at the top of the dock, watching us uncertain. We stood side by side, no words needed. Finally, I said, He nodded. I know. I looked at him. Am I strong enough to do this in public, to face her? He squeezed my arm gently. You're the strongest person I know. I closed my eyes and let the wind wrap around me. The docking lanterns flickered. The lake was vast, dangerous, free. That was our symbolism. Freedom wasn't safe. Freedom was open water. I opened my eyes. Then let's do it. He smiled, small and real. Tomorrow. Morning came clear and crisp. We started early. I pressed the wedding ring into my palm, no longer on my finger, but still there. A reminder of where I'd been and how far I'd come. In the conference room at Caldwell Towers, the hiss of the projector was the only sound. I felt every heartbeat, every breath. When it began, I spoke slowly, deliberately. I told the story not just about the attempted corporate takeover, but about deception, about the toll of family obligations, about rising above. I watched chairs lean forward, eyes focus on me or their phones. I felt the ring's weight in my hand. When I finished, silence reigned. Then the CEO spoke. That took courage. Cassidy, you've earned our respect. My chest tightened, relief and excitement pummeling every nerve. I sat next to Ethan, who squeezed my hand again, offering that steady anchor. Yet just as applause started to swell, my phone vibrated. A single text you'll regret today. It was from Vanessa. My breath caught. Vanessa, absent detached sister, had reached out in the moment I stood up for myself. Her message was a reminder the past isn't just dust in the mirror. Sometimes it steps back into the room when you least expect it. So here was the next fracture. That night, back at the lake house, the windows rattled in small gusts of wind. I stared out at the lake ring in hand. I felt both triumphant and hollow. Because because I'd survived so far. But dealing with Vanessa was a risk I hadn't planned. Ethan closed the study door behind him. He watched me quietly. Her voice matters too, he observed. I looked at him. Why reach out now, I wondered. Is she warning me to stop or testing me? He shrugged softly. Maybe she knows this is bigger than her. Maybe she's trying to be seen before everything changes. I felt a lump in my throat. Vanessa had always lived in her own light, bright and effortless. I'd always followed in her shadow. But now I was living in mine. I placed the ring into its box. I'm done pretending, I whispered more to myself than to him. He came closer, silent vigil. Outside, the storm raged again. But inside, something had changed. We were ready. The lake shimmered silver at dawn mist curling low over the water, as if holding its breath along with me. I hadn't slept, not really. Vanessa's message had wormed its way into my thoughts and stayed there all night. You'll regret today. My sister's voice so familiar, so cold. Even after everything I'd learned about our family's manipulations, I couldn't decide whether it was a threat or something else entirely, and that uncertainty ate at me more than any ultimatum my mother could deliver. Ethan was already up. He moved with that same quiet deliberation that I had come to recognize not just as caution, but as confidence. His blindness hadn't dulled his perception. It had sharpened it, honed it into a kind of sight I envied. While I was still searching for my place in this mess, he had already begun to shape his next move. He knew we were in the final stretch, but I sensed he was waiting for me to catch up emotionally. And maybe I finally was. I poured coffee for both of us and sat at the kitchen table feeling the weight of the ring box in my pocket. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. That ring had begun as a costume and object my mother insisted I wear to complete this farce. But now it felt like a relic. I didn't need it anymore, not as a mask, nor as a marker of loyalty. Ethan, I said softly, breaking the morning silence. Before we take this any further, I need to see Vanessa. His brow furrowed slightly, his head tilting in that way that meant he was listening deeply, weighing not just the words but what lay underneath them. She reached out, I continued. And I don't think she's finished with this story either. He stayed quiet for a beat, then gave a small nod. You're right, she's a loose thread. His calm agreement emboldened me. I wasn't asking permission, I was telling him what I needed. But hearing him affirm it made me feel less alone. So I texted Vanessa. Come to the lake house today, no more hiding. If you want to talk, do it face to face. Her response was instant. Be there by noon. The hours between sunrise and noon dragged in that surreal way that only waiting for confrontation can feel. I showered, dressed simply, jeans and a sweater, not a costume this time, but exactly who I was. I didn't rehearse what I'd say to her, I didn't know what would come out, and for the first time I didn't feel like I needed a script. At exactly 12, Vanessa's car pulled into the driveway. I watched her emerge from behind the wheel, impeccably dressed as always, but her usual ease was missing. Her sunglasses stayed on even as she stepped into the shadow of the porch, and her lips were set in a tight line. She didn't look like a victor. She looked like someone cornered. When she stepped into the living room, Ethan remained seated silent, his posture straight but utterly relaxed. Harper stayed at his feet, tail wagging faintly but alert. Vanessa removed her sunglasses with a sharp, almost theatrical tug and set them on the coffee table. Well, she said, her voice cool but thin. This is cozy. Her attempt at nonchalance didn't work on me anymore. Why now, I asked, immediately cutting through the polite facade she tried to drape over everything. She blinked, momentarily caught off guard by my directness. Why what? Why the message? Why threaten me? What are you still trying to protect or hide? Vanessa hesitated for just a second, then sank into the chair opposite me, legs crossed tightly, fingers clasped together too rigidly. I didn't come here to threaten you, she said quietly. I came here to warn you. My breath caught. Warn me about what? She glanced toward Ethan, who remained utterly still, though I knew he was taking in every detail, every tremor in her voice. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. You think you've won. That you've exposed Mom's scheme, saved the company, reclaimed your integrity. But there's something you don't know. Her voice softened, almost pitying. Mom didn't just leverage you for a fake marriage, Cassidy. She used you as collateral for something else. Months ago, she took out a line of credit tied to your name, tied to this marriage. She put you on the hook personally for debts she racked up. I felt the blood drain from my face. Ethan's head tilted slightly. She forged signatures. Vanessa nodded once sharply. Yes, more than once. And if you go too public, if you push her into a corner, she'll make sure the fallout lands squarely on Cassidy. The words hung in the air like a toxin. And just like that, the last puzzle piece clicked into place. It wasn't just about company shares. My mother had positioned me so that if this whole charade collapsed, I would carry the financial ruin, not her. Vanessa must have seen the horror dawning on my face because she spoke again more gently this time. You didn't deserve this, she said. But neither did I. And neither did Ethan. It was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever offered. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. I stood up slowly, feeling the tremble in my knees but keeping my voice steady. "Thank you for telling me," I said, meeting Vanessa's gaze directly. "But you're wrong about one thing. I haven't won anything yet." Ethan's lips twitched faintly, approval, recognition, maybe pride. I turned toward him, a decision crystallizing in my chest. "This doesn't change the plan," I said firmly. "We go forward. We tell the truth. All of it." Even as I said it, I felt my heart settle. Because I realized something vital, my mother's manipulations only worked when I stayed silent. But silence was no longer my currency. Truth was. Ethan rose, then his cane tapping softly against the floor. He reached for my hand, not to guide me, but to stand with me. Vanessa sat frozen in the chair, caught between regret and resentment. She knew, I think, that I had crossed a threshold she could never cross again. This was my life now. Mine. Not my mother's. Not Vanessa's. Mine. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon. By then, word of the drama swirling around Caldwell Technologies had already begun to leak. Reporters waited outside the building. Investors whispered in online forums. Social media speculated wildly. But none of them knew the whole truth yet. That was my task. I stood at the podium next to Ethan, who wore a simple black suit and kept his hands clasped in front of him, calm as ever. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath, felt the weight of every lie I had carried for months settle into my bones, and then I began. I told them about the fake marriage. I told them about the manipulation. I told them about the attempted takeover. And then I did something even more risky. I told them about myself. About what it felt like to grow up second best invisible, used as a pawn by the people I had most desperately wanted to love me. I told them the whole truth, not as a victim, but as a woman finally reclaiming her own voice. When I finished, the room fell into a stunned silence. Then Ethan spoke, and his words were simple but devastating. "Cassidy Harris is no longer my wife," he said. "But she is my partner. And together we are rebuilding this company on a foundation of transparency and integrity." His declaration felt like both an ending and a beginning. The questions from reporters came fast after that, but I answered each one clearly, calmly, without flinching. By the time the conference ended, I knew that whatever storm my mother tried to unleash in response, I would survive it. Because I wasn't hiding anymore. That night, back at the lake house, Ethan poured 2 glasses of wine. We sat on the deck watching the moon rise over the water. "I never asked you this," he said finally. "But what do you want now? Not just today, not just tomorrow. What do you really want, Cassidy?" I thought about it long and hard. And then I answered truthfully. "I want peace," I said. Not silence, not distance, just peace, the kind that comes from knowing I lived honestly. He smiled softly. "Then you've already won," he said. And I realized he was right. I had. The next morning, I opened the front door and found a package waiting for me. Inside was a single letter from Vanessa. It read simply, "You did what I couldn't. I hope one day you understand why I left." No explanation. No excuses. But something about it felt like closure. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it into a drawer, and walked outside. The lake was calm again. The sky clear. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. Story 2. My name is Liam Carter. I'm 34 years old, and to be honest, I don't talk much to my family these days. Not because I don't care, but because every time I try, I end up feeling like a villain in a play I didn't audition for. Growing up, I was the dependable one. The fixer. The golden kid who answered every late-night call when someone needed a jumpstart, who lent money without question, who cleared out garages and moved entire apartments on a whim. That all ended 6 years ago when my father passed away. His death was hard, but it wasn't grief that distanced me. It was what followed the inheritance war. My mother Margaret and her brother, my uncle Stuart, thought they could divide everything quietly, assuming I'd go along like I always did. But I didn't. And from that day forward, I became the outsider. The family's black sheep. I still don't know why I agreed to come back this year for Thanksgiving. Maybe part of me hoped they'd changed. Maybe loneliness got the better of me. Or maybe I just wanted to see if those old burned bridges were really reduced to ash. It was my mother who called 2 weeks before. She emphasized the words "real family gathering" over and over as if reciting a script. I should have recognized the warning signs. But against my better judgment, I said yes. Told her I'd bring dessert. I even splurged on an apple tart from that upscale bakery they all used to rave about. Walking into that house felt surreal. The tension clung to the air like fog, and my cousin Natalie offered the only hint of warmth, a quick side hug before retreating to her phone. Mom barely acknowledged me, stirring gravy with a determined indifference. Uncle Stuart was already seated at the head of the table like he owned the place, offering a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, look what the wind dragged in," Stuart drawled loud enough for everyone to hear. I didn't bother responding. I quietly placed the tart on the sideboard and shrugged off my coat. Dinner itself felt like a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. Despite empty seats, no one made room at the main table. I lingered awkwardly until my younger cousin Jake fetched a dusty folding chair from the garage, wedging me at the very edge of the table where I could barely reach the breadbasket. The whispers started almost immediately sharp, thinly veiled comments about certain people who disappear until the food's on the table and those who think they're too good for family obligations. I took slow, deliberate bites, reminding myself I'd survived worse. But then, right as the turkey was being carved, Uncle Stuart raised his wine glass like a gavel. "You know," he said, "not everyone here deserves a seat at this table." The clatter of forks against plates went silent. When I met his gaze, I saw exactly where this was headed. He was baiting me, and Mom, standing beside him, chuckled softly. That laugh, that dismissive little laugh, cut deeper than any insult. "Real family sticks around when it matters," she added, staring at the turkey like it was more important than me. Something inside me broke, not in anger, but in clarity. I looked around at those faces I'd celebrated birthdays and holidays with, and all I saw were people who had long decided I didn't belong. So I stood. No speeches, no angry words. I picked up my coat. No one stopped me. A few even looked relieved. As I stepped into the cool night air, it felt like an exhale I'd been holding for years. But as I sat in my car, hands gripping the wheel, my mind drifted to the study upstairs, the one room in that house they never cared much about. Dad's old safe was still there, hidden behind a framed watercolor. I knew they'd tried and failed to open it after the funeral. They assumed it held nothing of value. But I knew the combination. I helped him install it when I was 17. I hadn't touched it out of respect, but that respect had eroded tonight. I wasn't angry exactly. Just done. Done playing scapegoat. Done being the family's punching bag. So I drove around for an hour thinking. Then I turned the car around and parked 2 streets over, slipping through the back gate like I used to as a kid. The garage door was locked, but there was still a loose panel by the side entrance, a trick I remembered from teenage summers. Inside the house was humming with laughter, oblivious to my quiet return. I crept into the study. My fingers didn't tremble as I lifted the painting. The combination clicked easily. When the safe door swung open, I didn't find just dusty papers. Inside was a tidy stack of cash bonds, Dad's old wristwatch, the deed to the family cabin up north, and several letters addressed to me. I took everything, not hurried, not panicked, but steady, methodical, as if reclaiming what had always been mine. Before they sat down for pie, I was halfway across town, the safe now empty. That night, I didn't go home. I parked at a bluff that overlooked the city skyline and sat quietly with the safe's contents on the passenger seat. The topmost letter was in Dad's handwriting. I hesitated, but I opened it. It read simply, "Liam, if you're reading this, it means you came back. I knew you would. Everything in this safe belongs to you. I hid it here for that reason. I knew they'd fight over what they could see, but you understood what mattered. Do what's right. Always proud of you, Dad." It was the first time in years I let myself cry. But this time the tears weren't because of what they'd done to me, but because of what Dad had done for me even after he was gone. And that's where it really begins. The morning after Thanksgiving felt like an odd kind of peace, a silence so complete it was almost suspicious. I stayed in bed longer than usual, sunlight slanting across the piles of envelopes, bonds, and that old wristwatch sitting on my kitchen table. Every few minutes my phone would light up with a text or missed call. Most of them from Natalie, my cousin, who always sat quietly at family dinners, never choosing sides until it suited her. "Hey, Liam. Did you come back to the house last night? Everyone's freaking out. The safe was at you?" Another message from Mom, short and sharp. "We need to talk. Call me." Uncle Stuart, too, predictably blunt. "What did you do?" I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I made coffee, sat at the table, and read Dad's other letters. There were 3 more, each written like journal entries. Reflections on family disappointments, hope warnings, but one detail stuck out, a line scrawled almost carelessly in the second letter. "If they ever find out about the cabin, they'll twist it all. Protect what matters, Liam." The cabin. Dad and I spent summers there when I was a kid, tucked into the northern woods near a quiet lake. Nobody else in the family ever bothered to visit. It wasn't flashy or profitable back then, a simple timber place that needed constant repairs. To me, it had felt like an escape, but clearly to Dad it was something more. Now I wondered if the deed I'd pulled from the safe wasn't just paperwork, but the key to something bigger. By midday, the text turned to accusations. "Natalie again. Uncle Stuart says you manipulated something. He's calling lawyers." And then the kicker from Mom herself, "You took things that didn't belong to you. You're being cruel." Cruel. That word settled in my chest like a stone. After all the years of quiet tolerance, patient forgiveness biting my tongue suddenly, I was cruel, no. What I was now was clear. I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait. If Stuart was calling lawyers, that meant they were plotting their next move. They wouldn't stop at snide remarks and whispered judgments this time. They'd come for the lake house too. They always had their eye on what they thought could profit them. So I drove out to the cabin that afternoon. The roads got narrower and rougher the farther north I went, each mile a kind of unwinding of the years I'd spent wrapped up in their expectations. When I finally pulled into the clearing, the sight of the place nearly broke me. Weathered wood siding, sagging porch, but somehow still standing proud. The pine tree Dad and I planted together towered over the roofline, now a living reminder that some roots dig deep even when no one's tending them. Inside it smelled like dust cedar and old memories. The fireplace sat cold and empty, a stack of firewood still waiting beside it from God knows when. The kitchen table where Dad taught me how to play cards, the faded armchair where he used to read everything, was exactly as we'd left it years ago. It felt like sacred ground. But there was no time for nostalgia. If Stuart was serious about dragging this into legal territory, I needed to lock this place down. I took photos of every room, the deed papers clutched tight in my bag. Then I called a locksmith, asked him to come out first thing in the morning to change every lock on the property. Front door, back door, even the old shed out back. I wouldn't leave any entry point vulnerable. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching twilight settle across the water, I felt the weight of it all, not just the property, but the history, the legacy Dad had quietly protected for me. He must have known even as he hid those letters in the safe that they'd try to claw their way into this too. And then my phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't another angry message. It was a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then pressed play. Uncle Stuart's voice came through smooth, but with that familiar, oily undertone. "Liam, listen. We need to talk. There's something about your father's trust you should know. Let's not make this ugly. Call me." That phrase, "let's not make this ugly," landed like a challenge. As if the ugliness hadn't already defined everything between us for years. But his tone was different this time, less smug, more careful. Almost like he was hiding something. I listened to the message twice, then forwarded it to a lawyer I knew, Greg, an old college friend who specialized in property law. I added a short note. "Can you meet tomorrow? I think they're planning something." By the time I locked up and left that night, the cabin felt different, not just a refuge, but a chess piece in a bigger game. They didn't just want the contents of Dad's safe. They wanted control of the one place where Dad and I had ever really been free of their manipulation. Driving back to the city in the dark, the lines on the road blurred with memory and worry. I knew this wasn't over. Stuart's call wasn't a truce, it was a warning disguised as an invitation. And somewhere in my gut, I felt certain that whatever he knew, whatever secret he was about to reveal, would change everything. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just defending some old cabin in the woods. I was defending the last intact piece of my relationship with my father. The place that still held truth and history untouched by their greed. The cabin wasn't a symbol of wealth, it was a symbol of integrity, legacy, and defiance. It was my inheritance in every sense that mattered, and I'd fight for it in ways they never expected. And as I crossed the city limits and headed back into familiar streets, I felt my phone buzz again, but this time, it wasn't Stuart. It was Natalie, just 2 words, her first text all day that felt real. "They're coming." I didn't answer, but I knew what had to happen next. By the time I parked outside my apartment that night, Natalie's 2-word warning kept replaying in my head. "They're coming." But what did that mean exactly? A visit? A threat? Or something more subtle and insidious? I didn't have to wait long to find out. Just as I unlocked my door, headlights swept across the front of the building. A sleek black sedan slowed, paused for a beat too long, then drove off. Uncle Stuart's car. No mistaking it. He wasn't coming to talk. He was circling, watching, calculating. I could feel it in my bones the same way you know a storm is coming before the clouds even gather. Inside, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I sat at the kitchen table with the deed in front of me, the letters from Dad stacked beside it like an arsenal I hadn't yet deployed. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. The tension between us had morphed into something symbolic, a clash of values, pride, and principle. For them, the lake cabin was now about reclaiming control, correcting the mistake Dad made by trusting me instead of them. For me, it had become a fortress, not just physically, but emotionally, a place where my identity and independence finally had walls of their own. The next morning, I met Greg at his downtown office, a minimalist space with sharp lines and glass walls that felt almost surgical in its precision. He was waiting with coffee and a thick folder labeled simply Carter Trust. "I went over everything again last night," Greg said without preamble. "Their case is paper thin. Your father's trust is solid. The deed is clean. There's no backdoor they can exploit legally." I exhaled, slowly, relief mixing with dread, because Stuart wasn't a man who played fair when the rules didn't work for him. "What about the voicemail?" I asked. Greg's expression tightened. "It's bait. He wants to rattle you, make you doubt your position before they even file anything. A bluff, but a dangerous one because if you react wrong, they'll turn it into leverage. I nodded, feeling the old instincts rise, the ones Dad taught me on long hikes. Through the northern woods, move carefully, observe everything, don't show your next step until you're already 3 ahead. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin. The locksmith was finishing up replacing the old brass locks with heavy-duty deadbolts and reinforced strike plates. "Anyone tries to get in now," he said, "they'll have a hell of a time." I thanked him and paid in cash, keeping everything quiet. But as I walked the perimeter of the property, something felt off. Footprints, fresh ones, led around the back where the woods pressed close. Someone had been here recently watching. My chest tightened, a reminder that Stuart wasn't just circling metaphorically. He was probing for weaknesses, testing how far he could push before I'd push back. I stayed that night at the cabin, made a fire in the old stone fireplace, cooked a simple meal on the battered stove. As I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, the stars sharp and cold above the dark water, I felt something deeper settle inside me, a resolve that didn't come from anger but from clarity. This wasn't just about defending a property line, this was about defending boundaries Dad had trusted me to hold. The cabin wasn't valuable to them until it became valuable to me, and that I realized was the real battle. The next morning, before driving back to the city, I took my father's old fishing knife, the one he kept in the tackle box we'd used every summer, and carved a small symbol into the railing of the porch, an arrow pointing outward. It was something he'd taught me when we camped as a kid, a way to mark your way back home if you got lost. It felt right to leave that mark there, a reminder to myself that this was home now, no matter how much they tried to erase me from it. Back at my apartment, Natalie finally called. I debated answering, but curiosity won out. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Liam, Uncle Stuart's planning something. I overheard them last night. He hired a private investigator. He's digging, looking for anything he can use against you." I felt a flash of gratitude toward her, but also wariness. Natalie had always floated in the middle, careful not to offend anyone too much. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. A pause on the other end. "Because this is different. He's talking about making you look unstable, about questioning whether you're even fit to manage the property. He's not just coming for the cabin, Liam. He's coming for your reputation." Her words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't enough for them to win materially, they wanted to strip me of dignity too. Frame me as ungrateful, unbalanced, undeserving. That's when I understood the deeper game. This wasn't about one deed or one safe or even one inheritance. It was about rewriting the family narrative. They needed to cast me as the villain to justify what they were doing, and I wouldn't let them. "Thank you for telling me," I said, my voice calm. "But if he's really going that far, then it's time I stop playing defense." Natalie hesitated again. "What do you mean?" I didn't answer. Instead, I looked at the old letters from Dad spread out on the table and noticed something I hadn't before. A final line scrawled almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the last page. "Check the ledger at the cabin. Truth is always in the details." The ledger. That was the next move, and I knew exactly where it was hidden under the false bottom of Dad's old writing desk at the cabin. A place no one but me would think to look. The keys, the trust, the cabin itself. All of it was just the surface. The real evidence, whatever Dad wanted me to find, was still waiting. And as I gathered my keys and prepared to drive north again, I realized this story wasn't nearing its end. It was just getting ready to turn. By the time I hit the highway heading north again, the tension that used to weigh on me felt different. This time I wasn't running from their judgment. I was driving straight into the heart of it, determined to find whatever it was my father wanted me to see. The cabin had always been more than old timber and cracked windows. It was a symbol of the kind of family we could have been, honest and simple before pride and entitlement poisoned everything. That ledger he mentioned, it wasn't just a record. It was a message, maybe even a final gift. The forest thinned as I neared the lake and pulled up the gravel driveway. The pine tree Dad and I planted together swayed gently, and for the first time in years I felt grounded, not haunted by that memory. Inside, I moved quickly. The desk was where we'd always kept fishing maps and camping permits, but as I slid open the bottom drawer, I noticed the faintest seam along the back. A false panel exactly where Dad would have hidden something important. My heart was racing, but my hand stayed steady as I eased it loose. There it was, an old leather-bound ledger, worn around the edges but intact. I flipped it open. Not finances, not boring old estate lists, but meticulous notes. Dates, observations, even transcriptions of conversations. Some from recent years, some older. As I scanned the first few pages, a cold clarity settled over me. These were records of meetings Dad had with Uncle Stuart, and my mother carefully documenting how they pressured him, manipulated financial decisions, and undermined me behind my back for years. Every time they treated me as lesser, every time they suggested I wasn't trustworthy or capable, it had been part of a pattern, and Dad knew. He didn't just suspect it, he wrote it all down in detail to make sure I would one day understand I wasn't imagining it. Even private remarks they'd made about me, cruel things I'd only overheard fragments of, were right there in his handwriting. Margaret, Liam's too soft. Can't run things after I'm gone. Stuart, he won't fight us. He's loyal to a fault. Page after page, year after year, evidence not just of their disdain, but of their intention to keep me marginalized. The ledger was a weapon, but not of revenge, a weapon of truth. I sat in Dad's old chair, the ledger heavy in my lap, and felt something shift inside me. All my life I had wondered if I was exaggerating, if maybe I had deserved the distance between us. But this proved it. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't weak, I was their scapegoat because they had decided it served them best. And now for the first time, I was the one holding the narrative. Just then, the crunch of tires outside broke the silence. I peeked through the curtains. Stuart's car. He didn't even bother parking discreetly this time. He got out slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive coat, as if this were just another boardroom negotiation. I could feel it in my gut. He thought he was about to corner me. I took a breath, straightened my posture, and walked calmly to the front door, but didn't open it right away. Instead, I let him knock. Once, twice, a third time louder now. Then his voice through the heavy door, Liam. We need to talk. Let's not make this ugly. I almost laughed at those words again. Their favorite line. As if it hadn't already been ugly for years. Finally, I opened the door just enough to see him clearly, but kept the chain lock latched. His smile was polite, but his eyes calculating. You've made things difficult, he said smoothly. But we're willing to be reasonable. We can work something out. Share the cabin. Keep it in the family. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I held up the ledger so he could see it clearly through a crack. His smile froze. You know what this is? I asked, my voice steady. His pupils narrowed. Where did you get that? He said almost too quickly. Dad kept it, I replied. He kept records, Stuart, of everything. The manipulation, the gaslighting, the way you and Mom made sure I was always doubted, always excluded. It's all here. For the first time, he didn't have a ready retort. I could see it how he was recalculating, revising whatever script he'd rehearsed on the drive up. I didn't give him a chance to regroup. You won't win this time, I said quietly. Not because of lawyers or threats or clever words, because I'm done playing by your rules. I know exactly who you are now. And this cabin, it's mine. Legally, morally, and practically, you've lost. There was a long pause, then he leaned in slightly, his voice low. Think about what you're doing, Liam. This will divide the family forever. That line. As if the family hadn't been divided for decades already, just on their terms. I didn't bother answering. I simply closed the door, slowly relocked it, and sat back down at the desk, placing the ledger gently on top. Outside, I heard his car engine start. He didn't knock again. And that's when I realized something I hadn't seen before. This wasn't just about protecting Dad's legacy or reclaiming my own dignity, it was about changing the narrative they thought they could control. They would spin their version of this story, no doubt. To cousins, to neighbors, maybe even to lawyers. But I had proof. Solid, undeniable proof that everything I'd felt all these years had been real. That ledger wasn't just my weapon, it was my freedom. The next morning I called Greg. I want to formalize everything I told him. The deed of the trust, even this ledger. I want to prepare a complete record just in case they try anything else. Greg agreed without hesitation. Smart, he said. They're on their heels now, but it's good to make it airtight. I spent the day cataloging every item in the cabin, photographing the condition of each room, even documenting my repairs. Not for them, but for me. To turn this place into a record of something honest, lasting, and clear. Late that night, as I stood again on the porch beneath the pine tree we planted together, I touched the carving of the arrow I'd made the day before. It felt different now, not just a mark for finding my way home, but a mark of survival. And then almost imperceptibly my phone buzzed again. A new message, this time not from Natalie or Stuart, but from my mother. Just one line: if you're ready to talk, so am I. I stared at the screen for a long time, the night air cold against my face. This story wasn't over. Not yet.